Hey, what's going on? This is the Body Punch Podcast. My name is Naz. Let's talk about Paul versus Woodley. What's going on? Big fight coming up. Paul versus Woodley. The welterweight king versus the YouTube sensation. It's coming this Sunday, August 29th. And the build-up to this fight has been impeccable. The promotion that has been done by both camps, the back and forth, you could see how personal it's getting. This fight has been marketed perfectly. And I wanted to do a breakdown of the whole card, especially the key fights that are being showcased on this card, which feature the likes of Tommy Fury, the half-brother of Tyson Fury. We see Amanda Serrano on this card as well. And then we're going to talk about the main event, Jake Paul taking on Tyron Woodley. And back to the way that this card has been marketed, that has to be hand in hand with the way that Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley have done so much media. Whoever wants an interview with these guys, they're getting it. And these guys are bringing it on. In every single one of these interviews, we've seen it in the face-to-face that they did with Showtime and Ariel Helwani. They've done it in the open workouts, on social media, with Tyron Woodley coming out with music videos and Jake Paul doing what he does best and just making as much noise as possible. This fight is all over the place. This is what people are talking about. There's also a UFC card this weekend. It was on August 28th. And not that many people talked about it as compared to this massive fight. Now, I'm not sure about what the actual crowd themselves in Cleveland, Ohio, what they're going to be like. Because on every one of these broadcasts, every one of these YouTube interviews that Showtime does, they're still asking people to buy tickets to go to the actual event. So when it comes to that, that doesn't look like a good sign. They might just have a bunch of tickets left. But who knows what the actual crowd is going to be like. We've seen Cleveland before in the past in fight sports, and they've always been amazing. We've seen them in the UFC. We've seen a couple boxing matches, but mostly the UFC has gone there, and the crowd has always been amazing. And I think it's because they don't get many of these MMA boxing cards in that area from the major promotions. So whenever someone goes down there, it's always something very special, especially at the time when Stipe Miocic was the heavyweight king and he was going on his run of being the greatest heavyweight of all time. Cleveland was a hotbed for him because he was the hometown kid, a firefighter in the area. And that Cleveland crowd was always something amazing. But we're going to see what it's going to be like for Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley. I think when it comes to the pay-per-view numbers, this is going to be very interesting. And I've seen a couple people bring this up, and I think it's a great point, is Jake Paul able to get the same amount of pay-per-view buys as some of the big name fighters out there? Now, I think that Tyron Woodley is going to add to this mix as well. That's why I think he's such a great opponent for Jake Paul. He's able to bring the eyeballs from his UFC career, from his social media following, and we've seen what he's done in the past. That's why it's so interesting, and it's so great that Tyron Woodley is facing Jake Paul. He's just the perfect opponent for him. And for this card, which is the regular price of any pay-per-view bout that Showtime puts on, we're going to see how Jake Paul stacks up. Now, we never get the official numbers. I mean, we get these numbers from promoters, and we'll see what Showtime says is the amount of buys that Jake Paul is able to generate. But this is going to be a great way to figure out where Jake Paul is at when it comes to his social media following him to his boxing matches. And we'll see the type of numbers that he does, especially with an opponent like Tyron Woodley, who I know many people think that Jake Paul is going to run him over, but I think that he's going to give him a good fight. If there's nothing that comes out of this, I think that Tyron Woodley is going to give Jake Paul a great fight. And that's another reason why I wanted that I tick off Tyron Woodley being the perfect opponent for Jake Paul in this juncture in his career. This is amazing matchmaking. Jake Paul is swiftly moving his career forward step by step and moving at a very relative quick pace compared to his other counterparts in boxing. A lot of boxers start off with an extensive amateur career that leads them into his or her professional career. And in their professional career, at the beginning stages of that, they're fighting people with equal or maybe even worse records. And so when it comes to Jake Paul, he's moving his career in a very quick manner, and he's moving up in competition at a rapid pace compared to other boxing fighters. And Tyron Woodley is a big jump up, especially from his fight against a YouTuber, his fight against Nate Robinson, and then Ben Askren, where he got that nasty KO in the first round. From those other fighters, Tyron Woodley is a different animal. This is a person that has proven his striking capabilities in MMA. This is also a person that has taken a real shot from professionals in welterweight, in the welterweight division of the UFC. And he has shown to be resilient to those shots, aside from a few occasions, which we saw on Jake Paul's robot. He had the vicious KO that Marquardt had on Tyron Woodley, where he just beat him up against the cage and got that devastating knockout against Tyron Woodley, replaying on his robot, which is a masterclass in trash talking. He's just upping his game in that as well. Jake Paul is. But Tyron Woodley is no joke. He's a big step up in competition. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this podcast. But let's go to the opening pay-per-view bout of this card. Tommy Fury versus Anthony Taylor. Anthony Taylor coming out and talking a whole lot of mess to Tommy Fury, the half-brother of Tyson Fury, the heavyweight champ, and going to be having some massive fights. Had a bunch of massive fights. I don't have to tell you guys, with Deontay Wilder, and he's done amazing stuff, defeating Klitschko when he was the monster at his time. And big expectations have been set on Tommy Fury's shoulders because of his brothers, or because of his brother, and I believe his cousin. Tommy Fury has big expectations put on him. Also, his father is also putting a lot of pressure on him. His father amps up both of his sons in fighting, and he's a massive reason why these two are at the level that they're at. Now, Tommy Fury, for him coming into this fight, he's been labeled as maybe the next matchup for Jake Paul. This could be the layup that he needs to get that Jake Paul fight. But he's going to have to go against Anthony Taylor, who is an MMA fighter who has dabbled in boxing before, 7-5 in his career. He is formerly a featherweight, and now he's going to be taking on the giant Tommy Fury. I'm going to get them mixed up a bunch of times, but Anthony Taylor is coming in here, and he has nothing to lose, and he has everything to gain with defeating Tommy Fury. Anthony Taylor, most people predict, is a speed bump for Tommy Fury, and Tommy Fury is just going to go through him like a hot knife through butter. But that's not what Anthony Taylor believes. And what we've seen from him throughout this whole press conference and interviews and all this kind of stuff is his supreme confidence. Every opportunity he gets, he gathers the crowd of media and proclaims to them how he's going to defeat Tommy Fury, even though, in many people's opinion, he has many disadvantages coming into this fight. And the biggest one being the height and the natural weight of Tommy Fury. This is Tommy Fury's natural weight class at 6 foot. And Anthony Taylor, like I said before, his MMA career being at featherweight or at lightweight. I think he fought at 145 and 155. But Anthony Taylor is not going to be the one telling you that he has all of these disadvantages. It looks somewhat delusional that he's coming in and saying all this stuff, saying that he's going to be the one knocking out Tommy Fury. Anthony Taylor does have a lot to back himself up with. He's trained with AJ McKee. He's training with AJ McKee's father. And he's coming in there with all that confidence. Even AJ McKee is talking about how Anthony Taylor is looking in this fight coming up against Tommy Fury, and he says he's looking great. But a person so young in their career like Anthony Taylor is, 7-5, going in and fighting a boxer like Tommy Fury, even though he doesn't have an extensive career to himself, being 6-0. But I think that the weight, the height, there's a lot of things going against Anthony Taylor. But I'm just going to say it here. The dog in Anthony Taylor is not going to allow him to go out without a fight. That's what I've seen. That's what I've heard from him. And kudos to Anthony Taylor taking full advantage of the moment, taking full advantage being on this card with Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley. This is the biggest card that he has been on. This is the biggest card that a lot of these fighters have been on by a country mile. So let's talk about the next fight, and I think we're just going to dive right into it. You know, just a quick thing, kudos to Amanda Serrano being one of the greatest female fighters, one of the greatest fighters, male or female, and she's going in there, and she, all the odds makers, all the betting, everybody betting is saying that she's going to win by a landslide, but let's see her do it. This is going to be a great introduction for all of these new fans that are going to be coming out to watch Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley. So I think that we're here for a show where a lot of these fights that are on this card are here to just pepper the main event and add name value to a lot of these fighters like Montana Love and Ivan, and we can see it throughout this card. There's only 6 fights on this card, but these fighters are going to be gaining some notoriety and some extra boost in their career. Jake Paul has mentioned this multiple times, but this is probably going to be the biggest payday for a lot of these fighters coming into this card. And this is just due to being underneath Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley. Now, let's talk about the main event. This is the one that I want to spend the most amount of time on. Jake Paul, 3-0, going against Tyron Woodley. Jake Paul has had an amateur fight before this, so he's had 4 fights in total, if we're counting his amateur career as well. Tyron Woodley, the welterweight king, and on the Mount Rushmore of the welterweight division for the UFC for sure. He is going in there in his boxing debut, and at the age of 39, he's taking on Jake Paul, who is 24. This is going to be, this is one of those fights that a lot of people just don't know what's going to happen. Now, we know Tyron Woodley's career. We've seen what he's done in MMA. We've seen all of the amazing knockouts. We've seen the smarts that he brings, his IQ that he brings into the octagon and fights like with Darren Till or with Wonderboy, the first one. We've seen the IQ that he brings. We've seen him brutally knock out a bunch of people like Koscheck. That's one of my favorite knockouts of all time. And you can see it in the pinpoint accuracy that he displays in that fight, where he got Koscheck with a shot. He was down to his knees, and he hit him with that 1-2 down the pipe to take out Koscheck for the first time in his career, I believe, where Koscheck got knocked out like that. So we can see a big height discrepancy. We saw it in the weigh-ins. Jake Paul coming in at 6'1", Tyron Woodley coming in at 5'9". Tyron Woodley, again, welterweight in the UFC, which is 170. And Jake Paul naturally is the bigger man. I don't know what he walks around at, but I think it's around like 190 something. So naturally, he's the bigger guy. He's fought at this weight class before, even though it's only been 3 pro fights and 1 amateur fight. So he's fought at this weight class before. We've seen him knock out people in boxing before. He's spending a lot of time in Puerto Rico with his team out there of pro fighters who are getting him trained and ready for this massive test. I think by the broadcast that we're watching, I think by all of the social media comments that I'm seeing, a lot of people think that Tyron Woodley is going to get trucked. He's just going to get run over. As Jake Paul said, he thinks that it's going to be a speed bump. But I think people are just going with the flow on what they've heard from Jake Paul, what they've heard from other commentators. And in these types of scenarios, when you have YouTubers taking on MMA fighters or whatever it may be, pro athletes taking on MMA fighters, boxers, whoever, they might not know the full extent of that person's career. Even though, yes, Tyron Woodley is 39. Yes, he's on a 3-fight skid in the UFC. And he has been cut from the UFC. This still doesn't show the type of experience that Tyron Woodley has had in Madison Square Garden, in Las Vegas, fighting with the biggest crowds in MMA. This guy is MMA royalty. He's done a lot of amazing stuff in MMA. Yes, this is boxing. Yes, this is a different sport. But I don't think it's going to be as one-sided as people think it's going to be. This is someone that's taken trained shots before. This is someone that has has been in this situation before. And Jake Paul, we just don't know that much about him. That's what makes this so interesting. Jake Paul could come out there and show us something that we've never seen before from him. He's talked about fighting in different stances. He's talked about fighting with different tactics. But this is just something that we haven't seen from Jake Paul in all of his 4 fights, which have been super quick. The first one was a little bit longer, but that one was against a YouTuber that it had headgear and all that stuff. But this fight is a lot different from those other fights. Albeit the Ben Askren fight, yes, it was with another fighter who was coming from the UFC, who has fought in Bellator. And this is not me trying to amp up the MMA fighters and be on any side. I know my podcast is focused on both MMA and boxing, but I do talk about MMA a lot. I'm just trying to be as realistic as possible that Tyron Woodley does come with a lot of veteran experience in these situations. And even in his last fight against Vicente Luque, Tyron Woodley did put on, he put it on Luque at the beginning. Yes, he did get finished in that fight, but you could see that he still had the dog in him. He still wanted to, press the pedal to the metal right at the beginning of that fight, and he wasn't going to go out real easy, and he didn't. He put it on Luque, who is a trained fighter in the UFC, amazing striker, decorated, and Tyron Woodley was still able to go against him. Yes, he is on a 4-fight skid, but if you look at his past fights against Kamaru Usman, Kobe Covington, Luque, Gilbert Burns, those are all top of the food chain fighters still in the UFC. These are not guys that are at the bottom level that have disappeared from the UFC. These are still main event high contenders in the UFC. But I do think that Jake Paul's savvy, the way that he's able to navigate his career, like I was talking about at the beginning of this podcast, has been expertly done, has been expertly fine-tuned, and he's slowly but aggressively moving his career in an upward trajectory. Now, I've seen his list of fighters that he wants to fight. I think he said that Canelo is next for him. We all know that's not going to happen, and even if it did, Canelo, I don't even want to talk about it, actually. It's just, it's not going to happen. This is a guy at the top of his career. He's not going to go down and fight Jake Paul unless he wants to make a lot of money quickly and easily. But Tyron Woodley for Jake Paul might be the perfect setup for him. And I think if Jake Paul does defeat Tyron Woodley, then, man, I don't even think that Tommy Fury is the right opponent for Jake Paul. Tommy Fury might be the right opponent for Jake Paul if he loses. If there was any way for Jake Paul to get a fight against Masvidal, which I don't think is going to be happening, because now Jake Paul has rubbed Dana White a little bit wrong, unless Dana White might be trying to figure out a way to go against Jake Paul, put him up against a fighter that could take him out. I heard some people talking about some other UFC fighters, and who knows what Dana White is thinking. If Jake Paul does win, it's all up to Dana White and company to decide on if Jake Paul will fight another MMA fighter. If not, they're going to have to find another boxer with the type of social media following in general, that these MMA fighters are bringing. Yes, Ben Askren did get knocked out in the first round brutally, but he does have a following that came to watch the fight. Tyron Woodley has that following that are going to come and watch this fight. Who in boxing, because the UFC most likely won't allow any of their fighters to fight Jake Paul. Who in boxing brings this kind of crowd, this kind of following to a Jake Paul fight? We're going to have to figure it out. We're going to have to find out. I think that Tommy Fury, yes, he is a big name in the UK, but I don't think he's as big of a name as some of these MMA fighters Jake Paul is fighting. You know, some people have thought of Darren Till being the perfect matchup for Jake Paul, a striker who fights at this weight class, who is naturally big. He might be the perfect person to fight Jake Paul and take him out. But Jake Paul is not going to put his career in jeopardy just for a grudge match like that. That's not the way that this guy's operating. This is one thing that I've taken of note when it comes to Jake Paul's career, is that even though he might have a grudge with someone, he's still thinking like a businessman. I'm not going to compare his boxing style or anything like that with Floyd Mayweather. But Floyd Mayweather, no matter the grudge, no matter whatever it was, still looked at his career like a business. And he fought the people who would do the right kind of business. And that's what Jake Paul is doing. That's what he's doing by fighting Tyron Woodley. So this is going to be a great fight. I'm really excited and really curious to see what happens. And I really appreciate you listening to me talk about this card. And let me know in the comments down below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or leave a review on any of the podcast platforms. That'd be really appreciated. Like, subscribe, hit the bell notification, all that good stuff on YouTube. I really appreciate it again. And if you want to listen to it on any of the podcast platforms that I just talked about, then go ahead, do so. Spotify, iTunes, wherever, Apple Podcasts. And I really appreciate, again, you taking the time and listening to me talk about this. Going to be a fun fight, really excited, and really eager to talk to you guys about the results. Because either way, this means big business either way. Tyron Woodley wins this fight, big business for him in his boxing career. If Jake Paul wins this, he's getting shot out of a cannon. And this is going to be a massive test for both of these guys. Really excited. I really appreciate it. Thank you again. This has been the Body Punch Podcast. My name is Naz. Bye.